The cemetery on the hill was the only place in the city that still felt honest to Naya Porter. The grass was patchy, the stone angels were chipped, and the air always held a chill, even in late spring. Nothing here pretended to be prettier than it was. She liked that. It made it easier to sit in front of her mother's simple headstone and talk as if the world wasn't slowly closing in with unpaid bills and disconnected phones. Today, though, the hill didn't feel empty. Nia climbed the last set of worn stone steps and stopped so abruptly that the dried flowers in her hand sagged forward. Her mother's section, usually quiet, ignored by anyone who wasn't blood, was occupied. 6 men in dark suits stood scattered in a loose semicircle around the grave as if they were guarding it. Their shoes didn't match the cracked path, and their posture screamed training. They weren't family. They weren't church folk. They were something else. At the center of it all, with his hands slid into his coat pockets and his head slightly bowed, stood a man she'd never seen before. Korean, tall, composed like someone who'd never had to ask permission in his life. Her first thought was irrational and immediate. They came to repossess the dead. What else is left to take from us? "Hey!" she called, voice sharper than she intended. "What are you doing at my mother's grave?" Every suited head turned. The man in the middle was the last to lift his gaze. When he did, the impact of his attention felt almost physical. His eyes were dark, clear, and too focused, like he was evaluating her the same way he would a threat. "You're—" He studied her face. Elaine Porter's daughter. The fact that he knew her mother's name without looking at the stone made something hitch inside Nia. Welcome to Korean Mafia lovers. Before we dive into this intense story of hidden debts and dangerous protection, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more captivating stories like this one. "How do you know that?" Naya demanded, stepping closer despite every instinct telling her to run. "Who are you, some kind of city official? Debt collector?" Behind the man, one of the suits smothered a reaction at the word debt. The central man didn't move. "I'm not from the city," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that made each word deliberate. "And I'm not here to ask for anything." "Then why are you standing over her like you own the place?" The wind tugged at the edge of his coat, revealing a hint of ink curling along his wrist where his shirt cuff ended. Not decorative ink. The kind of mark that meant something in neighborhoods where people learned early not to stare too long at certain symbols. "My name is Im Jin-yuk," he said finally. "Your mother saved someone important to me a long time ago. I'm here because I owe her." Nia's grip tightened around the stems of her flowers. "Saved how?" He glanced at the stone, then back at her. "In a way that cost her more than she admitted to anyone." She almost laughed, short, bitter. Her mother had worked herself into the ground for decades. What more could she have possibly given? "I've been paying for this plot, for maintenance and the hospital balance she left behind," Jin-yuk continued, quietly, every year. Nia went very, very still. The world seemed to narrow down to just his words and the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. "You've been paying my mother's bills?" she asked, each word careful like stepping on glass. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since she died." Her stomach rolled. The funeral home had told her someone anonymous had covered the burial when she was too broke to afford even the cheapest option. She'd assumed it was a church fund, some anonymous donor, divine pity, anything but this. "Why didn't you say anything before?" she whispered. He shifted his weight just enough to register as a deliberate choice. "Because this was between me and Elaine, not you. She's dead. And I'm keeping my promise," he replied, "whether anyone notices or not." His men stayed silent, eyes scanning the perimeter like they were protecting a business meeting instead of standing in a graveyard. They were used to guarding deals, shipments, meetings in dark warehouses. Guarding a grave was new territory, but what their boss wanted, they executed without commentary. Nia took another step closer, resentment and bewilderment tangling in her chest. "You didn't even know me. You never checked on us. We were drowning while some stranger was quietly honoring a debt in the background?" His jaw worked once, a muscle ticking near his ear. "I knew enough to know she wouldn't have wanted my world touching you." A cold realization slipped into her bones. "What is your world, exactly?" He held her gaze without flinching. "Not the kind you ask to join." The answer told her everything and nothing at once. Around them, The city sprawled below the hill, oblivious to whatever was happening in this forgotten corner of the cemetery. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why show up with suits and stand here like it's some kind of ceremony?" He finally looked away from her, just for a second, toward the city spread below the hill. "Because someone else found this grave," he said. "Someone who shouldn't have." The words sent ice through her veins. "What do you mean?" "They're watching you, Ms. Porter," he added quietly. "Looking for leverage. They know I come here. They know your connection. That puts you in the middle of something you never asked for." She swallowed against the dry burn in her throat. "Who is they?" "The people who want me gone," he said, "and who don't care who they cut through to make that happen." She thought of the bills stuffed into kitchen drawers, of the landlord's last warning, of the way every system she turned to had quietly informed her she was on her own. Now she was learning she'd never been alone. She'd just been watched by the wrong people. "So what?" she said hoarsely. "I'm supposed to be grateful I've moved from poor and invisible to poor and target?" His expression changed. Not anger, not offense. Something like regret flickering at the edge of a man taught not to show weakness. "No," he said. "You're supposed to be safe, and I failed to keep this far enough from you." He stepped closer, not so near that it felt threatening, but enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, fatigue carved into a face used to hiding it. "I can fix that," he continued, "if you let me." Nia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You think you can just swoop in now and reposition my whole life because you feel guilty about some old debt?" "I think," he said slowly, "that the woman who saved my little sister from getting caught in a crossfire didn't do it so I could stand here and watch her daughter get caught instead." The words hit harder than she wanted them to. Her mother had always been vague about the day she got that scar on her shoulder, said it was from being in the wrong place at the right time. Nia had never pushed for details because her mother's face would close off whenever she asked. "You're saying my mother stepped in front of a gun for your family," Nia said, "and you didn't think that was worth explaining sooner?" "I thought," he answered, "that the greatest respect I could give her was to keep you far from everything that led to that moment. I was wrong. Keeping you in the dark didn't stop them. It only left you defenseless." Around them, his men shifted almost imperceptibly as a car rolled past the cemetery gate, slowed, then continued. The movement was so subtle most people would have missed it, but Nia caught the way they all tensed, hands moving closer to their jackets. "We can't continue this conversation up here," Jin-Yuk said. "You're on display. Come with me." Something in Nia resisted the instinct to obey men who gave orders like that. She'd spent her whole life being told what to do by people who had power over her, landlords, bill collectors, social workers, bosses who paid minimum wage and acted like they were doing her a favor. "And if I don't?" she asked. "Then they'll keep circling," he said, "and they won't care that you're unarmed." He wasn't threatening her. He was describing reality. Her reality had never been safe. Not really. But this was a different level of danger, the kind that came with names and faces and specific intent. She looked back at her mother's name etched in stone, the dates that bookended a life of struggle and sacrifice. "You always wanted me to make smart choices," she whispered under her breath. "I don't know if this counts." Then she turned and walked toward the black sedan waiting near the path, leaving behind the only honest place she knew for something far more complicated. The Im estate was less ostentatious than Nia expected. There were no gold statues, no gaudy chains, just an understated modern home set behind discreet gates. The security, however, was not subtle. Cameras layered in blind spots, motion sensors, silent guards posted where most people would never see them. Inside, the air smelled faintly of citrus and something warm, like tea, and underneath all of that, tension. "Take her to the sitting room," Jin-Yuk said to one of his men. "I'll join you in a moment." Nia stood in the doorway instead. "I'm not being stashed like freight." His mouth curved just enough to suggest the shadow of a smile. "Noted. Then walk with me." He led her through a corridor lined with understated art, not the kind of flashy displays she'd expected from someone in his line of work, but genuine pieces that spoke of careful selection rather than expensive showing off. They stopped outside a partially open door. Inside, a little boy sat cross-legged on the floor, stacking wooden blocks very carefully. His hair fell over his forehead in slightly uneven strands, like someone had cut it at home. A nanny nearby pretended to read, but her eyes were on the child, watchful and protective. "Appa," the boy said quietly when he noticed Jin-hyuk. "Hey, Haru," Jin-hyuk replied, his tone softer than Nia had heard it. "This is a guest." Haru's gaze slid to Nia, curious but cautious. He had his father's dark eyes, but where Jin-hyuk's were sharp and calculating, the boy's held the kind of openness that hadn't been touched by whatever world his father inhabited. "Is she staying?" he asked. "That depends," Jin-hyuk said. "Depends on what, exactly?" Nia wondered. He closed the door gently and turned back to her. "That's Haru, my son. The reason your mother stepped in front of a bullet when he was still in a stroller." The room seemed to tilt for a second. "She saved him." "She saved me," he corrected. "Losing him would have ended me. She understood that even though she'd never met me." Nia's throat tightened. "So you've been visiting her grave every year, paying her bills, paying for the stone. But you never once said, 'Hey Nia, by the way, your mother took a bullet for my kid. I never wanted you to think you had to repay that,' he said, 'or that my help came with chains.'" She gave a humorless half-laugh. "Kind of ironic, considering I'm standing inside a Mafia boss's house now." He didn't deny it. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything he wasn't saying, and everything she was starting to understand. "I can't change what I am," he said finally, "but I can change how I use it, starting with you." He led her to a study, lined with books in multiple languages, Korean, English, Japanese, Chinese. The desk was clean except for a single photo, Haru as a toddler, grinning at the camera with chocolate on his face. Over the following hour, Jin-hyuk showed her files, photos, bank records, not to impress her, but to make one thing brutally clear. This wasn't a game. Im Jin-hyuk didn't run drugs or human trafficking. His money came from smuggling high-demand items through ports and from fixing problems for powerful clients who needed situations handled off the record. To some, that made him less bad. To others, it made him more dangerous, because his deals operated in the grey where no law could reach. The rivals who'd found her mother's grave belonged to a group that had been encroaching on his roots for months. They wanted his territory, his contacts, and now they wanted his weaknesses. Family. "The moment they linked your name to hers and hers to me," he said, "you became leverage. I refuse to let that stand." "So what's your plan?" Nia asked. "Hide me in some safe house forever. Do you want that?" "No. Good, because you'd hate that." He studied her across the table. "You have two choices. I can send you out of state with protection, money, and a new identity. You'd be safe, but you'd be starting from nothing. Or, she pushed. "Or you stay here," he said, "under my protection, in my house. Haru will think you're here for him. You'll be part of his world. And under that cover, I deal with the people who thought they could use you. Being under your roof won't paint an even bigger target on me," she said. "The target is already there," he replied. "This way, you're not standing under it alone." She stared at him, processing the weight of what he was offering. Safety, danger. Both options had plenty. "Do you decide who I am in either of those scenarios?" she asked quietly. "No," he said. "That's your decision. Where you live. What you do after this is handled. Who you become. I can remove threats. I can't tell you who to be." "What do you want me to choose, Mount?" she asked. His answer was immediate but quiet. "I want you here. With us. But that's selfish." She thought of the empty apartment she'd be going back to, the landlord notices, the way grief echoed louder in spaces with no one in them. Then she thought of Haru's careful hands stacking blocks, and the way he'd looked at her like the presence of someone new didn't scare him, just intrigued him. Family hadn't felt like an option for a long time, only obligation. "What would I be here?" she asked. "Some charity case you rescued?" "No," Jin-hyuk said. "You'd be someone my son could learn to trust. Someone whose mother I will be grateful to until my last breath. And someone whose wishes I will honor, even if one day they take you far away from me." It shouldn't have weighed so much, but it did, because for the first time since her mother died, someone was tying her existence not to what she owed, but to what she meant. The decision felt both impossible and inevitable. She could walk away, disappear into witness protection, start over with nothing but safety. Or she could step into a world that was dangerous and complicated and real in ways her old life had never been. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course. Take all the time you need." But even as she said it, Nia knew she'd already decided. The question wasn't whether she would stay. The question was whether she was brave enough to admit it. Nia chose to stay, not because she trusted the Mafia, but because she trusted Haru's laugh when she made a joke about his block towers looking like architectural masterpieces that would make Frank Lloyd Wright jealous. Because she saw the way the boy's shoulders relaxed when she sat on the floor with him and let him explain his constructions in quiet, careful sentences. The first week was an adjustment period that felt like learning to breathe underwater. Everything in the house operated on rhythms she didn't understand, phones that rang at odd hours with conversations in Korean, men who appeared and disappeared without explanation, the way Jin-hyuk could shift from gentle father to commanding presence in the space between heartbeats. But there were also unexpected moments of normalcy. Haru insisting she help him with homework at the kitchen table, the way Jin-hyuk would pause in the doorway when he came home, like he was still surprised to find her there. The gradual realization that the house had been missing something before she arrived. Not just another person, but the particular kind of warmth that came from someone who had no agenda beyond being present. "Miss Nia," Haru said one evening, looking up from his coloring book, "do you miss your mama?" The question caught her off guard. They were sitting in the living room while Jin-hyuk finished a phone call in his study. Outside, the security lights cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. "Every day," she said honestly. "Appa says she was very brave." "She was," Nia agreed, glancing toward the study where she could hear the low murmur of Jin-hyuk's voice. "She always did what was right, even when it was hard." "Like staying here with us?" Haru asked with the innocent directness only children possessed. Nia felt her chest tighten. "Yeah, like that." Weeks turned into a delicate routine. Nia helped Haru with homework, joined him for meals at the long dining table that had once hosted nothing but tense business discussions, and sometimes lingered a little longer in the kitchen if she heard Jin-hyuk come home late. He didn't treat her like a servant, didn't treat her like a guest. He treated her like someone whose presence had become a fact of his day, necessary, valued, but never taken for granted. "You're good with him," Jin-hyuk said one night, finding her in the kitchen after she'd finished helping Haru with a science project about the solar system. "He's a good kid," she replied, rinsing the glue from her hands. "Smart, curious. He asks the kind of questions that make you think." "He's never had that before," Jin-hyuk said quietly. "Someone who answers his questions without treating them like interruptions." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications about the kind of childhood Haru had been having before she arrived. "What about his mother?" Nia asked, then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, that's not my business." "She died when he was 2, Jin-hyuk said simply. "Cancer. Since then, it's been nannies and housekeepers and me trying to figure out how to be enough." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but she heard it anyway. "You are enough. He adores you." "He needs more than adoration," Jin-hyuk replied. "He needs someone who can show him what it looks like to choose kindness, to choose to stay when things get difficult, to choose family even when it's complicated." The words felt like they were about more than just Haru. Later that night, Nia found herself standing on the back terrace looking out over the city lights. The dragon tattoo on Jin-hyuk's neck was visible in the soft lighting when he joined her, intricate scales that seemed to move with each breath. "He's getting attached," she said quietly. "So am I," Jin-hyuk replied without hesitation. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Nia stepped closer, close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the railing. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he continued. "You were supposed to be safe and distant, a debt honored from afar. But I'm not distant anymore. No." He finally turned to face her. "You're here, in my house, making my son laugh, making me remember what it feels like to have someone to come home to who isn't afraid of me." The vulnerability in his voice was carefully controlled, but she heard it anyway. "Are you afraid of what that means?" "Terrified," he said simply. "Because the closer you get to us, the more danger you're in. And the more I care about you, the less rational I become about protecting you." Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. The expression that crossed his face when he read the message made her stomach drop. "What is it?" "They know you're here," he said grimly. "My rivals. They've been watching the house, taking photos." He showed her the screen, a grainy image of her and Haru in the garden that afternoon, building a fort out of fallen branches. The sight of Haru's innocent face in what was clearly a surveillance photo made something cold and furious rise in her chest. "They're going to make a move soon," Jin-hyuk continued. "And when they do, they won't just be coming for me. They'll be coming for both of you." The weight of what she'd stepped into finally hit her fully. This wasn't just about old debts or protection anymore. She'd become part of something that could destroy everything she'd started to care about. "What do we do?" she whispered. His eyes darkened with something that was part determination, part fury. "We end this, before they get the chance to hurt what matters to me." The way he said "what matters to me" made it clear he wasn't just talking about Haru anymore. "How?" she asked. "Leave that to me," he said. "But Nia, once this starts, there's no going back. If you want to leave, if you want that new identity and fresh start, now is the time." She looked at him, really looked at him. The sharp angles of his face, the careful control that never quite hid the intensity underneath. The way he held himself, like a man who'd learned early that showing weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. Something shifted in his expression, relief, gratitude, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "Then we do this together," he said. "Together," she agreed. Neither of them mentioned that together in his world often meant until death do us part in ways that had nothing to do with wedding vows. The attack came 3 days later, not at the house but at the small market, where Nia had insisted on going despite Jin-hyuk's protests. She'd wanted normalcy, just for an hour. She'd wanted to pick out groceries like a regular person, to pretend that her biggest concern was whether they had the brand of cereal Haru liked. Instead, she got 3 men in a van who grabbed her in the parking lot while Jin-hyuk's security was repositioning after a false alarm at the house. The kidnapping lasted exactly 47 minutes. They never made it out of the district. Jin-hyuk's response was swift, surgical, and absolute. By the time Nia was returned to the house, shaken but unharmed, the rival organization had received a message they wouldn't forget. Their leadership had been systematically dismantled in a single night, but the cost became clear when she found Jin-hyuk in his study afterward, blood on his shirt, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He was burning documents in a metal waste bin, feeding papers to the flames with mechanical precision. "You could have been killed," she said from the doorway. "They could have killed you," he replied without looking up. That was unacceptable. "So you declared war on an entire organization." "I ended a problem," he corrected, "permanently." The clinical way he said it should have frightened her. Instead, she found herself stepping into the room, closing the door behind her. The smell of smoke and something metallic hung in the air. "How many people died tonight because of me?" she asked quietly. "How many people died tonight because they thought they could use you to hurt my family?" he countered. "The answer is exactly as many as necessary." She watched him feed another document to the flames. His movements were controlled, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set, like he was holding back something that wanted to break free. "Is this what my life will be now?" she asked. "People dying because I exist in your world?" Finally, he looked at her, really looked at her. "Do you want to leave?" The question was simple. The answer wasn't. "I want to know if you did this because you had to," she said, "or because you wanted to." His hand stilled on the papers. "Both." The honesty was brutal and complete. "I had to protect you and Haru," he continued, "but I wanted to make them pay for putting their hands on you, for making you afraid, for threatening the first real happiness I've had in years." She moved closer, until she was standing beside his chair. "Jin-hyuk." "I know what I am, Nia," he said roughly. "I know what I do. I know the blood on my hands will never wash clean. But when I saw you in that parking lot, when I thought I might lose you before I ever had the chance to—" He stopped himself. "To what?" she pressed. He stood slowly, facing her fully. The firelight cast shadows across his face, making the dragon tattoo on his neck seem to writhe. to tell you that somewhere between honoring a debt to your mother and watching you make my son smile, I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air between them like a confession and a warning all at once. "You fell in love with me," she repeated. "Yes." "While planning to murder people who threatened me?" "Yes." She should have run, should have been horrified. Instead, she reached up and touched the side of his face, feeling the tension in his jaw, the exhaustion that went bone deep. "I fell in love with you too," she whispered, "and that terrifies me more than anything else that's happened." His eyes closed briefly, like her words were both relief and agony. "It should terrify you. Because you're dangerous. Because I'll never be able to let you go now," he said. "Not after tonight. Not after knowing what it feels like to almost lose you." She understood then that this wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about possession, about a love that came with the weight of his entire world behind it. It was about choosing to love someone who would burn down cities to keep you safe, and accepting that you were the kind of person who could love him back. "Then don't let me go," she said simply. When he kissed her, it tasted like smoke and promises, and the kind of forever that was built on blood and choice in equal measure. His hands tangled in her hair, and she could feel the tremor in them, not fear, but the aftermath of violence, the way a man's body processed the reality of what he'd done to protect what he loved. "I need you to understand," he said against her lips, "that this is who I am. This is what loving me means." "I understand," she replied, "and I'm choosing it anyway." The fire crackled behind them, consuming the last evidence of the night's work. Outside, the house was quiet, except for the soft sounds of security making their rounds. Somewhere upstairs, Haru was sleeping peacefully, unaware that his world had been threatened and defended while he dreamed. "What happens now?" Nia asked. "Now," Jinyuk said, "we build something worth protecting." The promise in his voice was absolute. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as a debt collector and a poor girl, but as a family forged in fire and sealed with blood. The aftermath of that night changed everything and nothing. The house felt different, safer, but also more real. The pretense that Nia was just a temporary guest evaporated, replaced by the understanding that she was home. Haru noticed first, the way children always do. "Miss Nia," he said one morning over breakfast, "are you going to stay forever now?" Jin-hyuk paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips, waiting for her answer. "Would you like that?" she asked the boy. "Yes," Haru said without hesitation. "Appa smiles more when you're here, and you make the best pancakes." Nia caught Jin-hyuk's eye across the table. The expression on his face was soft, unguarded in a way she'd never seen before. "Then I'll stay," she said. Over the following weeks, they settled into a rhythm that felt like the life she'd never known she wanted. Nia enrolled in online classes to finish her degree, something she'd abandoned when her mother got sick. Jin-hyuk insisted on paying for it, not as charity, but as investment in their future. "You're brilliant," he said one evening, finding her at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks. "You should have opportunities to use that." "I'm studying business administration," she said with a wry smile. "Think I'll ever get to use it in your line of work?" "I think," he replied, settling into the chair beside her, "that legitimate businesses need good administrators too, and I've been thinking about diversifying." The conversation was casual, but the implications weren't. He was talking about a future where his world could become something cleaner, something Haru could inherit without shame. "You'd do that?" she asked. "Change everything you've built?" "I'd do it for him," Jin-hyuk said, glancing toward the living room where Haru was building an elaborate castle out of blocks. "And for you." The transformation didn't happen overnight. Jin-hyuk began shifting his operations, moving away from the grey areas that had made him powerful but vulnerable. It was dangerous work, changing the nature of a criminal enterprise while maintaining the respect and fear that kept enemies at bay. But he had motivation now that went beyond survival or profit. He had a family to protect and a future to build. 3 months after the kidnapping, Nia found herself standing in the same cemetery where everything had started, but this time she wasn't alone. Haru held her hand on one side, chattering quietly about the flowers they'd brought. Jin-hyuk stood on her other side, no longer the stranger in a suit who'd guarded her mother's grave, but the man who'd become her anchor, in a world she'd never imagined joining. "Grandma Elaine," Haru said softly, reading the name he'd practiced. He'd started calling her that after Nia had told him stories about her mother's cooking, her laugh, the way she'd hummed while folding laundry. Nia felt her eyes sting. The headstone was the same, but everything else had changed. Fresh flowers every week, a small bench nearby where they could sit and talk, and most importantly, no more secrets. "Your mother saved my family," Jin-hyuk said quietly. "Now you're part of it, if you want to be." She looked down at their joined hands, hers, Haru's, Jin-hyuk's, linked like a bridge between past and future. "I think she'd like that," Nia whispered. The rival organization was gone, dismantled so thoroughly that their name had become a cautionary tale in the underground. Jin-hyuk's territory was secure, his family safe, his position unquestioned. But more than that, he'd found something he'd never expected to have. A woman who could look at all of him. The violence, the power, the tenderness he saved for those he loved, and choose to stay anyway. "Poor girl found men in suits surrounding her mother's grave," Nia said with a small smile, echoing the words that had started it all. "Turns out the Korean Mafia boss was paying an old debt silently." "And now?" Jin-hyuk asked. "Now he's not paying a debt anymore," she replied. "He's building a family." Haru squeezed both their hands. "Can we come back next week?" "Every week," Nia promised, "for as long as you want." They stood there as the wind moved through the trees, not as strangers bound by obligation, but as three people who had chosen to become something new together, a family that should never have existed but did, not because of debt, not because of duty, because of love, the kind that was worth fighting for, the kind that was worth everything. As they walked back to the car, Haru skipping ahead to chase a butterfly, Jin-hyuk caught Nia's hand. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. She thought about the question seriously, about the violence she'd witnessed, the danger she'd faced, the way her old life had been completely erased and rebuilt. "Just one," she said finally. His step faltered slightly. "What?" "I regret that it took men in suits surrounding my mother's grave for me to find you," she said with a grin. Relief and laughter mixed in his face as he pulled her closer. "I love you, Nia Porter." "I love you too, Im Jin-hyuk, debts, danger and all." Ahead of them, Haru had caught the butterfly and was examining it with the careful fascination of a child who'd been taught to appreciate beautiful things. When he released it, watching it flutter away, he looked back at them with a smile that held all the security and happiness they'd built together. A poor girl had found men in suits surrounding her mother's grave. She'd also found her home. Years later, Nia woke up in a bed that smelled like citrus and warmth, in a house that had become home in ways she'd never expected. Through the window, she could see Haru in the garden, now 8 years old, and teaching the neighbor's cat to sit on command with the patient determination he'd inherited from his father. The cat, Mr. Whiskers, was having none of it, but Haru persisted with the kind of gentle stubbornness that made Nia smile every time she watched him. Jin-hyuk's arm tightened around her waist as he stirred awake. "Morning," he murmured against her shoulder, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," she replied, settling back against him. "Haru's trying to train Mr. Whiskers again." "He gets that stubborn streak from you," Jin-hyuk said with a smile in his voice. "From me? He's your son. But you're the one who taught him that persistence pays off." She turned in his arms to face him. The dragon tattoo on his neck had been joined by a smaller one on his wrist, her mother's initials inked in delicate script, a reminder that some debts became blessings when you stopped fighting them. The business had transformed too. Jin-hyuk's empire now operated entirely above board, import-export, real estate, legitimate security services. It had taken time and careful maneuvering, but he'd managed to transition without losing the respect that kept his family safe. "Any regrets?" he asked. The question he'd started asking every few months, like he still couldn't quite believe she'd chosen this life. "Just one," she said seriously. His expression shifted, concern flickering in his dark eyes. "I regret that it took so long for Mr. Whiskers to finally sit," she finished with a grin, pointing toward the window where Haru was celebrating his victory with a delighted laugh. Relief and laughter mixed in Jin-hyuk's face as he pulled her closer. "I love you, Nia Porterim." The hyphenated name was new, official, as of 6 months ago, when they'd married in a small ceremony in the garden. Haru had been the ring-bearer, and they'd saved a seat in the front row for Elaine Porter, the woman whose sacrifice had brought them all together. I love you too, Im Jin-hyuk, forever and always. Outside, Haru's delighted laughter carried on the morning air as Mr. Whiskers finally sat on command. And somewhere on a hill across the city, fresh flowers waited by a simple headstone, placed there by a family that had grown from grief into something beautiful. A poor girl had found men in suits surrounding her mother's grave. She'd also found her destiny. Thank you for staying until the end. Korean Mafia Lovers has many more passionate and thrilling stories waiting for you. Subscribe to the channel to never miss our latest uploads. Your support helps us create even more captivating tales of love and danger.